please give a warm welcome to cinematographer Jomo Fray, Academy Award-nominated actress Aunjanue Ellis-Taylor, and writer-director RaMell Ross.
Well, you guys stood up. That's really nice.
Yeah, well, it's deserved. It's deserved. When I introduced the film, I mentioned about the point of view of the film. We've never seen anything like this. We've seen a film done from the point of view, but what you do is...
Okay, sorry.
No, it's all right. What you do is you make us feel, from the point of view, you actually take us inside the body of what the characters are experiencing. Tell us about how essential it was for you to do the film from that perspective.
Yeah.
Kudos to you for doing that.
No, thank you. It's I love the way that you talked about it already. You know, you began using language that has more to do with you know, the human process than it does the film process, and it was very much about trying to make the camera an organ. I made this film called Hell County this evening.
Brilliant documentary.
Thank you, thank you. And while shooting and trying to be engaged with, you know, the documentary aesthetic and what we know to be sort of the fly-on-the-wall observation, you know, you kind of realize very quickly, if you're a thinking person, that one, it's impossible to film something without altering it, and two, that it kind of does this thing where it seems like the image has no author, when the entire time, of course, the person is deciding what to point the camera at. They're choosing the focal length. They're choosing the you know, the T-stop, the F-stop, and it's interesting to think then about, like, how do you observe but also author? And that process, to me, I came up with the language called observational logic, in which you're using the camera as an extension of consciousness. And that was sort of the beginning of me being like, oh, I can have, you know, long lid, shallow focus, control the person's relationship to what they're seeing, exactly what I'm seeing. You have to see what I'm seeing. Therefore, it's kind of me. And that is like way before, you know, Nickel Boys. That's just part of my art process. And then get Colson Whitehead's book, you know, start talking with my co-writer, Jocelyn Barnes, you know, decide to make the movie point of view, try to extend the Hell County logic that I came up with, but then, you know, that's also different from giving it to a character. Mm-hmm. And I think people ask quite often, like, how did you guys get this funded? Like, POV, like studio, like impossible, like, you know, tell me about the process. And one of the things, I think, because we were very intentional with why we wanted to do it, which was to give, you know, vision to the Dozier School boys, to give the opportunity for an audience to not look at Elwood and Turner and watch them go through, but to live life as them, with them, as much as possible. That was like very poignant for the producers. Mm-hmm. And so POV became what we began with. And then, of course, you meet a Jomo Fray who can not only iterate it, but can, you know, advance it. And we were able to get with, you know, what you guys saw.
Jomo, we briefly talked outside about something that I found so revelatory, the fact that the camera points to things that are in between big moments, that you wouldn't think of the importance of that particular beat, or, you know, can you tell us about that approach? From my vantage point, I felt like that's, you know, these characters are going through this immense trauma, and they're hanging on to their humanity by looking for those moments that you normally wouldn't give weight to.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That I feel like was kind of connected to RaMell's first conversation we had around point of view, which was, pretty quickly we, in prep, RaMell and I spoke for, quite literally maybe 70 hours, just the two of us kind of trying to break down, well, what is point of view for this movie? What does that mean, and how do we visualize that? And I think pretty quickly we stopped using the term point of view and we started talking about it as a sentient image, that ideally what we wanted to do was to create an image that felt connected to a real human body, a real human person, someone who was navigating an oftentimes a hostile environment, and to try to make the image deeply present tense. I think that there's a way, as RaMell is already speaking about, maybe a more traditional cinema in which we are watching Elwood and Turner go through this. I think that for us it was more about, in maybe traditional kind of third-person cinema, when we're sitting and we're watching those images, there's a thin membrane between us as viewer and as image, what's happening in the image. And I think that that's comfortable. There are a lot of amazing movies that are made like that, a lot of movies I love. But I think for RaMell, it was always a question of how do we make this more immersive, and how do we perhaps puncture this membrane, not tear it down, but just do a small incision into it to hopefully create an even more kind of compassionate and intensely connected experience. Because, for us, it was about creating an image where, as a viewer, you're invited to live life concurrently with Elwood and Turner. Like, I think that was the thing that we started in camera tests to start to see, where how intimate that was, where just sharing time with them. Quite literally, you're experiencing time as they are experiencing time by sitting in the POV. And there's something that, for me at least, felt profoundly intimate with them. And I think it really gets to the heart of what you're asking, which is to say that we weren't trying to mimic human sight, but we were trying to create an image that felt like seeing, that felt like memory. So then it was asking questions of ourselves of, that's also why the aspect ratio is 4:3, why a lot of the movie is normal to telephoto, where it's meant to convey not what sight feels like, but how does the brain form meaning? How does it understand where it is and what is around it, and if it's in danger, if it's not in danger, or actually a cascading amount of subtext that we kind of recognize in any given interaction, in any given moment. So then coming to the concept of trauma, for us, it was, okay, well, how do you and I remember trauma in our lives? And usually it was, we were talking about this right before, where oftentimes I find it interesting that people who get into car accidents often say that they remember the moment before and they remember the moment right after the crash, but rarely does the brain kind of hold on to the moment of trauma itself. It usually dissociates, it displaces, it hooks on to details or things in the space that can ground it. And so for us, again, it was asking those questions to try to visualize, a deeper idea of thought or feeling in a body and what that feels like.
But you also hang on to, in those moments, you hang on to hope and optimism. And that's actually one of the things that I find brilliant about your film, is that these two young boys are being dehumanized in this film, but you still are able to portray a sense of hope and optimism on these two young men.
Yeah, that was a thing RaMell said even in the first meeting, where he's like, I don't want to show any violence on screen. Like, it's obviously there, and we want to, connect to that. But yeah, I think, I'm reminded of things like Primo Levi. I'm reminded of situations where, in moments of deep inhumanity, you would think that every aspect about the experience is inhumane. But, that's kind of one of the, I think, the great hypocrisies of human life, is that actually within moments of the Jim Crow South, actually a lot of Black life is, yes, defined by some of the inhumanity of those moments, but it's also defined by remembering being in the kitchen with your grandmother and making a sandwich, or looking at your skin for the first time, or like watching light push through a window and seeing it play against the wall. That like actually it's even in those mundane moments that, to me, if I look when I look back on my life, it'll sure be some of these big moments in my life, but it'll also be these really small, ineffable moments that feel beautiful and powerful and grand. And I think that, yeah, a lot of the movie was kind of sitting in what RaMell would call adjacent images, where they're images that invite the viewer into the deeper psyche of the character, but don't have necessarily a plot intention to them, so that you can kind of sit in these more ineffable things and kind of get to know the person that way.
I actually, before I get to Aunjanue, I'm not ignoring you, Aunjanue. I think the world of you. But something you brought up about the point of view that you were behind the camera the whole time. And I was thinking in particular the scene where Hattie says goodbye to Elmwood. And you're behind the camera and you're watching all the emotion pouring out of Aunjanue. It's a heartbreaking scene, but you're behind the camera. Did that affect you? Were you...
Yeah, deeply. I think, you know, it was also a formulation that RaMell had put forward at the beginning of production, where, you know, he asked the question of what would the world look like if in the history of humanity every image was taken by a person kind of shooting the image as if they were shooting their brother, their sister, their mother, their friend. Like, what would the world look like if every instance of an image being captured was captured compassionately? And I think that as a cinematographer, I've of course like worked with many great actors. I've shot actors, but this movie was a fundamentally different experience. I think that being inside of the performance, like oftentimes RaMell would rehearse with the actors, work with them. I would kind of stay close by and just watching kind of how Brandon or Ethan interacted with the scene, and then was about kind of imbuing the performance that I saw from them into the camera. And oftentimes they would be, you know, a few inches away from my body, so that, you know, their scene partner, like Aunjanue, still had a haptic connection with them and was able to touch them, feel their space in it. But like, as someone making an image, you know, it's like in those moments that, like the ones you're talking about, when Hattie hugs the camera, that's me she's physically hugging. And I think that changes how you form an image as an image maker, when quite literally you're just having that kind of physical connection and intimacy with an actor, and when also you have to kind of be vulnerable in a different way as an image maker. You're not, again, you don't have that membrane when you as the camera are like looking at them feeling emotions, like you're inside of it. And there are moments when if the actor, you know, finds something more interesting in the moment in the scene and kind of goes off of script and feels it, as a camera, you have to react to them. You have to be there with them as a character and meet them in the middle, which I think was some of the moments that RaMell and I kind of like, you know, we had tested these images, we had talked about it a lot in prep, but I think those are the moments that kind of bowled us over during production, were those moments where it was like the camera had to, you know, meet the actors in their position of deep vulnerability. And yeah, I think that was a powerful thing that I think I'm definitely going to take with me off of this project, is a different way of thinking about images, of trying to always imbue every moment with the same level of present vulnerability that this film kind of fundamentally asks for every single moment.
Yeah. The brilliant Aunjanue. Thank you for being here. Aunjanue, the scene where you tell Elmwood that, you know, the lawyer has walked away from with the money is so heartbreaking, such a powerful scene. And I couldn't help but think that you're staring at the camera. You don't have a scene partner. The scene partner is the camera. You know, walk us through that dynamic. That must have been really challenging, to be working just directly straight to the camera.
Yeah, you know, I for me, when I'm able to be, I don't know, succeed at all in what I'm trying to do, it has always been rooted and founded in being able to be connected to a human being, you know, and I didn't have that I've never felt like, I've never felt safe by myself on behind a camera. I've always felt insecure, uncertain. I've always had a certain amount of skepticism about cameras. I don't particularly like them very much. No disrespect to you. It is the function of acting or cinema, acting for film, where it is you have this machine in front of you, and it tells you at every second that what you're doing is being observed. And what I have always tried to do is feel like the experience I'm having is one that no one sees, that it is a secretive thing, right? And this is the opposite of that. So how do you create intimacy with something that you don't trust? So that was a process to me. That was a process for me overcoming that. But the great thing for that scene particularly is because I wasn't prepared for that, because I didn't know that that is what I was doing that day. I just knew that I had to tell my grandson what I needed to tell him. And all of those feelings of insecurity, uncertainty, anger, frustration, not being able to connect the way I wanted to connect, which is how I was feeling personally as a person who was acting, I feel like Hattie was feeling those things too. Mm-hmm. So the great thing about that is it was in alignment, I think, because of that.
I read somewhere that you pursued working on this project, that you wanted to work with RaMell. Why was it about RaMell and this project that you needed to be involved in?
Well, I didn't know about Nickel at all. I saw Hale County, and I just I was so I saw it, and I felt like I was experiencing the work of someone who was spending time with people I knew and loved. Right? I'm from Mississippi. I'm from the rural Black South. Hale County is about people from rural Alabama. And in many ways, I have always felt portrayals of the rural Black South have been, the work of someone who parachuted in and then parachuted out. It felt always distant, it felt fishbowl-y, it felt disrespectful. I saw Hale County and I felt like I was experiencing someone who knew me. And that was the first time I had ever felt that way. So I didn't know about Nickel Boys, but I just wanted to tell him how he made me feel. I felt like I was in the presence of kinfolk, and I wanted to tell him how that made me feel. And I did stalk him. I did like call his job. I did email him in an email address that I know he never checks, right? And then a couple years later, Nickel came around, and I just wanted to do it,
Well,
Yeah.
bless you. You're
Thanks.
amazing in the film. I want to ask you, RaMell, about there are moments in the movie where the point of view switches out of the body, and we actually feel this third person point of view, but we still feel the body experiencing what is happening. Like, so you guys understand what I'm talking about, is the scene in particular with Cheeky Pete, the bar, where we're experiencing point of view, but then all of a sudden there's like almost like out of body experience. Tell us about that approach. And
Man, there's just so much to say, you all. I love that question specifically at this moment in time, in the way in which both of these two have talked about the process so far. Pardon me if I ramble briefly, but I'm trying to remember. Okay, so if you start, to me, I've always wondered why folks have not made first-person films, just in general, right? Like the language of cinema on the internet, shorthand for generations of now, is first person. Everyone's making first-person films, but it's kind of never made it to the commercial space for all the reasons one could imagine, you know, money, intention, et cetera, but the camera language of cinema history started third person. Yeah. It started from the outside, kind of looking at folks. And if you take, it's interesting to think about films in which then they try to get subjective, and then they do like snorri cam on the front. So it starts observational, then you get really close to a person and like you feel like you're in their head, but then their default is popping back out. So what is if the default is you start in? If the camera is an organ, if the camera is inside the body and you're looking, what happens when you have something traumatic happen? Then maybe the camera's dislodged. So it's kind of reversing the order. And it reminds me of this really brilliant philosopher, this guy named Charles Mills. He talks about the sort of, you know him?
Yeah, about the self-reflection.
Oh, no, but I guess it's related.
No, sorry, I mean.
You're talking about Charles Cooley, the Looking Glass Self.
Yes.
Which is, you know, you learn about yourself through the way in which other people look at you, which is a sociological conceptual framework that just has to do with, you know, the world reflecting back the way they see you, that kind of becoming you, because you kind of know no better. You only know yourself kind of from the inside, but you need someone to perceive you in order to build your identity and to sort of validate your independence as an independent person. But Charles Mills, he talks about the discontinuity between continental and Western philosophy and people of color, in that Western philosophy its foundation is Descartes. I think, therefore I am, right? We all know this. Maybe we haven't thought about it deeply. We kind of take it as our default because it was so long ago. And he's a black philosopher. And one thing he says, well, what happens if someone owns you? What happens if you're not a free thinker? What happens if you're programmed because you've never been seen as human? I disagree with I think, therefore I am. That assumes a person is free to think. I think for people of color, it's more like I feel, therefore I am. That's the way that we prove our that's the way we prove our consciousness and our individuality. And so I think it aligns, like in this moment, with taking the camera into your body and starting with feeling, and then when something happens, the camera's dislodged, and you see that when Elwood goes into the White House. That was like a true revelation for Jomo and I when we were like kind of shot listing in the moment in the White House. I remember like we both looked at each other and we were like, damn, you know, like that makes sense. That like justifies the way that we wanted to bring the camera behind David, adult Chicky Pete. You go into the bar scene, which you're mentioning, and you have this entire experience with your past and your history through Chicky Pete's, you know, almost monologues relatively, but yet he's there, not there. And who is this person looking over his shoulder? Is it him? Is it Elwood? Is it both? I don't know. But it's kind of cool.
I've seen the film twice, and your dynamic with the storytelling is a revelation. It's so inspiring. Jojo, I wanted to ask you about there are scenes in I want to be very specific about you know, brutality, where, you know, in particular the fight sequence where you show us how the audience is reacting to what we're seeing as opposed to actually showing us brutality. You know what I mean? It's like, and then you guys choose not to show too many punches. Normally in a fight sequence, we see all the action. Instead, you withdraw. You know, tell us about that approach.
Yeah, I think, you know, from the very first moment in our meeting, RaMell was like, I don't want to see any on-screen violence in this movie. Like, I know what it is, we all know what that is, and I don't know if that's necessarily helping us, and especially in the boxing scene, It was from.
We tried to show not one punch.
Yeah, we
tried to literally show not one punch, but then we saw a couple and we're like, that's actually kind of works for us.
Exactly. It's like no. Like shot listing it and like designing it and rehearsing it. It was exactly that. We never wanted to see Griffin Big Chet land a punch because that's not actually the violence of that scene. The violence is this larger ecosystem that exists around these boys where their brutality is sport. That this is about entertainment and it's about money and it's about this community, it's about power. And so like, it was like a really interesting scene because that is the scene that has the most points of coverage of anything in the movie. And it's also a scene where at some level, we needed the audience to buy into the aesthetic getting to that scene because in a lot of ways, we break a lot of the rules that we set up on what kind of POV is. And that scene we shot like hyper telephoto lenses, like 500 mil lenses that Dan Sasaki at Panavision custom made us. The lenses were all prototype lenses. So like we were getting prototypes as we were shooting. But for that one specifically, it was a set of kind of prototype long lenses for it, where it was, again, going back to that same idea of what does sight feel like? What does memory feel like? And I think it's one of those things that, as humans, we have a very wide field of view, but if I'm looking at this chair, the chair isn't in focus. It's more that my brain is doing selective focusing. It's focusing on this, so it is removing concentration away from everything else, even though optically all of this is in focus to the human mind. So really it's a question of then what are we looking at and what does it mean, which again is one of those things that I think is really interesting about POV that we would sort of learn as we were shooting. Where, in traditional cinema, when you maybe have a close-up of someone, and for example, it's a close-up of Elwood. Okay, in this close-up of Elwood, you are seeing how Elwood is feeling based on the small, minute pieces of his performance, of how does he feel by what does he see, by what we're seeing him feel. And I think something different happens in this aesthetic of being in point of view. You're without that information, and as viewers who have traditionally watched cinema, that kind of fundamentally unmoors us. So then it's not a question of, well, what is Elwood's feeling based on what I can see on his face? I would almost argue it then becomes a question in your head of, instead of what is Elwood feeling, it's like, well, what would I feel if this was happening to me? And then maybe, well, what is Elwood feeling and how can I know how he's feeling based on what his eyes are looking at, where his eyes are going, who he can maintain eye contact with and who he cannot maintain eye contact with, what feels and looks dangerous to him, what doesn't look dangerous to him. And I think that the boxing scene is kind of a culmination of all of those ideas of trying to fundamentally understand these two people, like Turner and Elwood, and their different worldviews and how they kind of either being more pragmatic or more optimistic, like how are they seeing the world at a very basic level. And again, hopefully inviting us as an audience to like not just see them experience something, but to sit through their thought process so that ideally, again, we're coming up with, oh, they're trading money and these people are all in on it, and Jesus Christ, the janitor's in on it too. And like that kind of feeling, having it being dawning on the viewer, which, even as an operator and as a camera operator is like a challenge because traditionally camera language tells us we want to, be ahead of the moment. And that entire scene, especially on those kind of lenses, were all about you have to be constantly a moment behind things that are happening so the camera fundamentally is reacting, not capturing, which again, sounds like a semantic difference, but I think actually makes a big difference as operators and as cinematographers because you're kind of needing to unlearn everything you've always been taught. Works with cinema, even though it's just a quarter of a second behind, everything has to be exactly a quarter of a second behind. Otherwise, it kind of feels uncanny or it feels like an effect.
Yeah, thank you. Aunjanue, one of the most impactful scenes I've seen in cinema this year is you hugging Turner and understanding the logistics of the filming. You were hugging the camera. Can you tell us about that scene that is, it's heartbreaking. It's so searing and moving and visceral.
I've had to talk about that scene quite a bit lately And so it's made me think about what I was thinking that day, you know, what was going on that day. And I remember that I was particularly unnerved and unmoored, you know, and I had to ask RaMell quite a bit, was it working? You know, what am I doing what you want? And that is, you know, that is a bit of a, you know, a departure for me from how I usually do things, you know. I usually try to, you know, fly as much as I can, and then you know, if a director doesn't, you know, wants to curate it a little more, then it becomes that process. But I really had to, you know, consult with him constantly about you know, what was happening and what I was doing and was it right. And it was really, I was having to do that because I was working in isolation. So if you have someone in front of you, you can have a feeling that, okay, me and this person are connecting, right? So it doesn't matter what RaMell's opinion of it is. I'm having an experience with this person. It feels right to me. It feels good to me. And that's my assurance that what I'm doing is working. But when there's no one there, you don't know. You're flying blind.
Wow.
And I knew what I wanted to do, right? But I had no assurance that it was working, but I still don't. But I take your word for it.
It worked. It worked. Please, reassurance to her that it worked brilliantly. Last question, because we have to wrap it up. It's like we've seen all these films that tell us the African American experience, the Black experience. But to this day, I have never seen a film that makes me feel from the inside, at least an attempt to us to feel and see the way things are. You know, I'm just wondering if your approach, and does it line up with that, the fact that we're actually seeing from the inside as opposed to from the outside?
Yeah, I really appreciate even like the things you even said in the hallway, because it, you know, you connect really deeply with what we did, and I think a lot of people do, but I think it's also difficult to articulate, especially after first viewing it at times, because you're kind of wondering what you've seen. I like to invite people to, and you know, I'm sure every filmmaker would say, watch my movie twice. The second time it's better, you know. Of course it is. Like, I promise you, this film, like it's one of the ones where the less you see, I wish I could do intros for all of them and say, guys, like relax, chill. The less you look for, the more you'll see. And if you watch it again, you'll actually see it. You'll just be feeling unnerved, some pleasure, some that was good, I don't get that the first time. The second time, it does continue to get rich in the way that Jomo explained the camera as the person is experiencing reality concurrently with you and with the character. You have to make the narrative post-experience. What cinema does is it forefronts the language of understanding. This philosopher, William James, he talks about perception or conception. What we're doing is perception before conception. So, you know, you think back on your day, and that's how it was. That's very similar to that's the approach we wanted to take, because there's something about the camera that fundamentally objectifies, intensifies objectification. And this is apologize for the long one, but this is what Aunjanue's saying about the trust. Like, she has this inner experience, she interacts with the camera, and then she looks at what the camera does, and that's not what she was doing. That's not what she thought. That's not what she felt. That's not what she looked like. It's how the technology of the camera has squished something into something two-dimensional, that's mixed relationships formally inside this cube that do not exist otherwise. There's this guy, Stephen Shore, who talks about the camera being a monocular device, and human beings are binocular. So it produces relationships perceptually that literally do not exist, But because it's as good as we've ever had as humans technology-wise, we believe it to be real, believe it feels accurate. But we also know that the fidelity of reality production has been shifting over time. Remember when the daguerreotype came out? Remember when black and white photography? That was the realest thing ever. Like on your mantle, like this is my mother. This is so beautiful. Photography freed painting. Painters thought painting was dead when the camera was born, because the camera, all painting before photography was geared towards realism. It was always moving towards, all of the angelic paintings were trying to get as real as possible. And then photography comes out 30, 100 years ahead of it. And then all of a sudden you get abstract painting. You get impressionistic painting. And I say that only to say that the shifting fidelity of reality is intertwined in the camera, which I like to call the sort of technology of racism, because it allows you to project your views or ideology that's programmed into you onto something that is relatively reductive and neutral. But I'll say last and least, sorry.
No.
I get really excited.
This is brilliant. So please go ahead.
What Aunjanue did, and what Brandon Wilson did, and what Ethan Harisi did, Fred Hetchinger and Hamish, like, it's not something that you can script. It's like nor something that you can predict or necessarily direct, right? It's the hope of the project. We do all the work beforehand, and then we bring these actors to a place and we say, like, make it alive. Like, we have all these ideas and we've talked ad nauseum about everything, but how do you make it alive? And what Jomo was saying, like how we were learning every day, was that we didn't realize the power of actors as talented as them, like looking with love through the lens into the character, into the audience, right? Like when we watch cinema, when we watch two people interact, they're looking at each other and they're having this emotional thing, and we pop in really close, we do an over the shoulder, we're approximating, getting into that angle of them looking, but it's them that's having it, and we're the voyeurs, scene partners in a third person sense, and oh, how emotional is that? And in the history of cinema for people of color, to go back to your question, looking is not being part of the family from afar. So there's something about watching the families across, the continent of Africa or the black community in which it's still easy to think as them as others. But if you're looked at with the same love that every black mother looks at their son, you're fundamentally in the family, you see the world differently. And that's what Aunjanue and them were able to do, is they were able to look with the same love. And then you go out and then you see the camera get looked at in the way in which the guy's poking the cane in the stomach. And you're like, oh, I see. These boys are being looked at always differently. Each one of us has always been looked at. And that's like the funny thing, is that we always think that people look at us the way they look at everyone else or something. It's like some weird human thing. Maybe it's not true, but I kind of feel it to be true. And so it's that love gaze, I think, that is this disruption and this feeling that you have about why this film feels different in relationship to a lot of other films in which people of color are part.
Mm-hmm. And thank you. And Aunjanue, I want you to have the last word. You had an instinct, you had a drive to be part of this project. You used the word trust earlier, you trusted RaMell. Was it fulfilled? How do you feel about the final?
Damn, I got to lead for this one because I don't know. I know, right?
I've been listening to RaMell for the last, couple of months, and I think we've engaged more than we did when we were shooting the film, and I've been hearing him talk, and I'm trying to figure out, how does he fall in the lineage of black photography, particularly, and black image making, and he makes me think of James Van Der Zee. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but what he essentially did was he took pictures of people who were being funeralized. So a lot of his photos are people in caskets. But what he did is as RaMell is saying, that what he saw was this image is not enough. This image does not properly tell what is happening. So what you'll see in his photos is you'll see the person lying in the casket, but up above you'll see pictures of like it almost looks like shadows of other people, and you'll see God or Jesus, you know, and that was him making the image more aligned with the experience of loss, with the experience of grief. Yeah. And I just see that RaMell is kind of falling in line with that the camera itself has been, as he calls it, the technology of racism, but it has been instrumental and complicit in diminishing Black life and diminishing Black people. And I see him falling in the line, in the lineage of Black photographers who said, no, this isn't enough. How do I make it more? How do I expand it? How do I make it feel like I am as a Black person? And how I experience Blackness not as limitation, but Blackness as liberation. So for me, having the experience of working with someone like him, and I'm not cracking up. I'm sorry, my voice. I'm not about to cry. Is what I'm trying to say. My voice is just tired. But I'm just so thankful. I'm so thankful because I feel like that I am a part of something that is bigger than me, and I'm excited to see what's next.
Well. Yeah. The three of you are great artists, and the fact that the three of you are here today and have worked together so brilliantly, we're so honored and grateful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody.